The bag stood at the foot of her bed, packed and buckled and waiting, and the Duke of Ashbourne found that he could not move. It was a small thing, that bag. A single portmanteau of worn brown leather, the kind a governess might carry, not a duchess. He had given her trunks enough over the years to fill a carriage, banded in brass, lined in silk, and she had chosen none of them. She had chosen this old case that had come with her from her father's house 11 years before, and she had packed it with her own hands, and she meant to leave. Alaric stood in the doorway of his wife's chamber with the last of the winter light going gray across the floorboards, and he did not go in, and he did not call out, and for a long, terrible moment he did not breathe. He had come only to tell her that the Ellinghams would dine with them on Thursday and that she must decide about the yellow drawing-room. He had knocked, out of the old habit of courtesy, and no voice had answered, and he had opened the door on an empty room and that waiting bag. There was a note folded on the writing desk. He knew before he crossed to it that it would be in her hand, small and even and unhurried, the hand that had answered his correspondence and kept his household ledgers and written to his tenants when the fever came through the low farms 2 winters past. He picked it up. His fingers were not quite steady, and he did not know when that had begun. Alaric, it read, and only that: "No, dear, no, my lord, no, husband, I have gone to my aunt's cottage at Wren's Hollow. Everything of the house is in order. Mrs. Pettigrew has the keys and the accounts, and Hodges knows the spring planting. You will not need me for any of it, and so I have stopped pretending that you might. Do not trouble yourself to follow. I am not angry. I am only, at last, done being the last thing you remember to think of. M." He read it 3 times. The words did not rearrange themselves into anything kinder. The room around him was very quiet, quiet in the particular way of a room its keeper has left, and he understood, standing there with the paper going soft in his grip, that he had not truly been inside this chamber in a very long while. The pale green hangings, the single miniature of her mother on the mantel. A pressed sprig of something, rosemary, was it, or lavender laid in a book of sermons she never seemed to read for their sermons. He did not know his wife's room. He had walked past its door 10,000 times, and he did not know it. She was not gone yet. The bag was still here. That was the only fact he could hold, and he held it like a drowning man. He went down the great stair 2 at a time, which he had not done since he was a boy, and the footman in the hall started to attention, and Alaric heard his own voice come out too loud. "Her Grace, where is she?" "The still room, I believe, your Grace," the man said. "She was seeing to the linens for Wren's Hollow. The carriage is ordered for the morning." The morning, he had until the morning. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the floor of his life tilt beneath him, as though a wall he had leaned against for 11 years without once looking at it had, in the space of a folded note, revealed itself to be a door, and the door to be already opening, and himself on the wrong side of it. He did not go to the still room. He wanted to, and he did not, because he had no idea in the world what he would say. That was the shameful truth of it, plain as the cold in the hall. The Duke of Ashbourne, who could bring a room of hard men to silence with 3 words, who had faced down his father's creditors at 23 and saved the estate that had been meant to sink him, did not know one single thing to say to his own wife that would keep her in his house. He went instead to his study, and shut the door and stood before the dead fire. How had it come to the bag? That was the question that circled him now, patient as a hawk. A man did not wake one morning to find his wife packed and gone. A thing like this was built, brick by brick over years, by hands that did not know they were building it. His hands. He made himself look at them. He had not chosen her. That was where it began, if he was honest, and he found tonight that he could no longer afford anything but honesty. 11 years ago he had wanted to marry Lady Georgiana Vale, and everyone had known it, and she had known it best of all, and she had married the Earl of Marston's heir instead because Marston's heir had not been half a step from ruin. Alaric had been 26 and land poor and proud enough to choke on it, and the Ashbourne name had needed a wife with a portion attached to steady the estate, and there had been a list. A literal list in his aunt's spidery hand, of the eligible young women of suitable family whose fathers would settle a sum on a duke in exchange for the coronet. Marian Ashcroft had been near the bottom of it. Good blood gone quietly threadbare. A father who was a scholar and a gentleman and no man of business. A portion respectable but not dazzling. A girl of 22 already whispered to be on the shelf, because she would not simper and had a way of looking at foolish men as though she could see the exact shape of their folly. He had chosen her because she was the sensible choice, and he had let her know it. Not in words, he had not been cruel. He had never once in 11 years raised his voice to her, but in 1,000 silences. He had married her in a gray coat with his mind on the North Drainage. He had spent their wedding journey reading his steward's reports. When Georgiana Vale's carriage had passed theirs on the London road that first spring, he had turned his head to watch it go, and Marian, beside him, had watched him watch it, and had said nothing, and he had thought at the time that her saying nothing was a great convenience in a wife. He put his hand over his eyes. Convenient. He had built his whole marriage on that word and worn it smooth and never once heard how it sounded. She was convenient. She ran his house so that he never thought about the running of it. She managed his mother, the dowager, whose tongue could flay a saint, so that he never had to. She wrote his difficult letters and remembered his tenants' names and sat at the far end of his table at dinners he had arranged for men who could be useful to him. And she was so quietly, perfectly competent that he had come to treat her the way a man treats a well-built house. He lived inside her care and never once looked up at the beams. And the boy. Alaric sat down, rather suddenly, in the chair before the cold hearth. He had not let himself think of the boy in a long time. Their son, born too soon in the 7th year of their marriage and living not quite a day. He had been in London when the pains took her early. He had come back to find it already over, his wife white against the pillows with her hair matted to her temples and her arms empty, and a small closed room upstairs that the nurse spoke of in whispers. He had stood in the doorway of her sick room then, too, exactly as he had stood in her doorway tonight, and he had not gone in, and he had not known what to say, and he had told himself it was because grief was a private thing, and a man ought not to intrude on a woman's. The truth was that he had been afraid of the enormous gray water of her grief, afraid he would drown in it, and so he had done what he always did with things too large to master. He had turned to the estate. He had thrown himself into the drainage and the mortgages and the improvement of the western farms, and he had made Ashbourne prosper as it had not prospered in 3 generations, and he had told himself all the while that he was doing it for her, for their future, for the family they would yet have. There had been no family. There had been the 2 of them, growing older on opposite ends of a great cold house, and a small stone in the churchyard with a name they never spoke, and the estate, always the estate, standing between them like a thing he had married instead. He heard distantly the sounds of the house at evening, a door, a step, the clink of the tea things being carried up. Somewhere in these walls his wife was folding linen into a case to take to a cottage in Wren's Hollow, and she had written that she was not angry, and he believed her, and that was the worst of it. A woman who was angry might be argued with. A woman who was only, at last, done, there was no argument for that. There was only whatever a man might build in a single night to set against 11 years of being taken for granted, and he did not think a single night was enough, and he thought he had better try anyway or lose the only good thing his life had ever quietly contained without his ever once thanking it. He rose, he would go to her, he would say what? That he was sorry. The word was so small against the size of the thing that he was almost ashamed to carry it to her. But it was where a man began, when he began too late, and so he took a candle and went back up the great stair with his heart going like a boy's. Her chamber door was open, she was in it. She stood by the window with a folded shawl in her hands, her back to him, and the last light was on her, and Alaric stopped on the threshold as a man stops at the edge of a room he is not sure he has any right to enter. She was not a girl any longer, neither was he. There was silver now at her temples, threading the dark hair he had somehow never once told her was fine, and she stood very straight and very still, and even now packed, decided, leaving. There was a composure to her that he had spent 11 years mistaking for coldness and understood all at once, standing in her doorway with his candle guttering to be strength. She had needed to be strong. He had never given her cause to be anything else. "You read my note," she said without turning. Her voice was quite even. "I asked you not to follow." "You asked me not to follow you to Wren's Hollow," Alaric said. "You did not forbid me your own house." She turned at that. There was the ghost of something at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, the memory of where a smile had once lived. "No," she said. "I suppose I did not. Careless of me. I am usually more thorough." The mildness of it undid him more than shouting could have. He came a step into the room. "Marian." "Please don't." She said it gently, which was worse. "Whatever you have come up to say, Alaric, please don't say it tonight in this light with that particular look on your face. You'll believe it while you say it. You always believe things while you say them. And then Thursday will come and the Ellinghams and the drainage, and by Friday you'll have forgotten you said it at all, and I'll be here still, folding your linen, waiting to be remembered. I have decided I would rather not wait to be remembered any more. That is all this is. It is not a punishment. It is only that I am tired, and I have found that I do not wish to grow old inside another person's afterthought." He stood in the middle of her small green room and had no answer, because every word of it was true. "I did not know," he said at last, and heard how weak it was. "No," she agreed, not unkindly. "You did not, that was rather the whole of it." She laid the shawl in the bag and closed it, and the small snap of the buckle was the loudest sound Alaric had ever heard. "The carriage comes at 8. You needn't see me off. It would only be more for the servants to talk of." He did not go. He stood there while the light failed, and she did not ask him again to leave, and at length he said the only true thing he had. "Give me the days until the carriage comes. That is all I ask. If you still wish to go at 8, I will hand you into the carriage myself, and I will not say one word to keep you, but give me the days between." She looked at him for a long moment across the little room, across the 11 years, across the small stone in the churchyard, and something in her face that had been closed came unlatched. Not open, only unlatched, the way a door left on the latch may still be pushed. "The carriage was ordered for tomorrow," she said slowly. "Then order it for the end of the week." He held her gaze and did not let himself look away, though every coward instinct in him wished to. "4 days, Marian. Give me 4 days to show you I have understood. If I fail, and I may, God knows I have had 11 years of practice at failing you, then go, and I will help you go. But do not leave in the morning believing I never saw you at all, because I see you now. I am ashamed it took the sight of that bag to make me look. But I see you now." The silence stretched. Down in the hall a clock struck the half-hour, patient, indifferent. "4 days," she said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "And then, Alaric, the truth, not the truth you believe while you say it, the truth you are willing to live." She turned back to the window. "You may go now. You have your days. I will unpack the shawl, only the shawl." He went out and closed her door with great care, as though the whole of his life balanced on the softness with which it shut, and he stood a long while in the dark passage with his dead candle in his hand. And for the first time in 11 years, the Duke of Ashbourne was afraid of the morning for a reason that had nothing to do with money. He did not sleep. He lay in the great dark bed that had held Ashbourne dukes for 150 years, and he stared at the canopy, and he made a list, because a list was the only tool his mind had ever trusted. And this time the list was not of drainage or debts, but of every day he could remember and could not account for. By dawn, he had understood a thing that shamed him to the marrow. He could recall in perfect detail the price of every parcel of land he had bought in 11 years, and he could not recall the color of the gown his wife had worn to their last dinner. He knew the yield of the western fields to the bushel. He did not know whether Marian took sugar in her tea. He rose before the servants, which unsettled the house, and he went down to breakfast to find the small dining room empty and one place laid. He asked the footman where her grace took her breakfast. The man looked at him with the carefully blank face of a servant who has been asked something he cannot believe he is being asked, and answered that Her Grace had taken her breakfast in the morning room at 7 these 11 years, Your Grace, with the household accounts, as she always did. 11 years. She had eaten her breakfast alone in a room down the passage every morning of their marriage, and he had eaten his alone here, and neither of them had ever thought to change it, because it had been arranged so at the beginning by his mother, and had simply gone on being arranged so, the way a river goes on running in the bed it first found. He carried his cup down the passage and stood in the doorway of the morning room. Marian looked up from the ledgers. She was not surprised to see him. She was never surprised. He understood now that a woman who has schooled herself to expect nothing is never surprised, but she set down her pen. "May I sit?" he said. "It is your house," she said. That is not an answer. Something flickered in her eyes. "No," she allowed. "It is not. Sit then if you like. The chair on the left does not wobble." He sat. There was a rack of toast gone cold and a pot of tea and the great blue-bound ledger open to a page of figures in her small, even hand, and he saw, glancing at it, that she had been reckoning the cost of the new roof for the almshouses in the village. The almshouses he had approved the money for 2 years past with a wave of his hand and never thought of since. She had been managing their building this whole while. He had not known there was a building. "The almshouses," he said. "They are finished," she said. "They were finished in the spring. Old Bessam and the Carter widows are housed dry, and the Lammas boy who lost his arm to the thresher has a room and a trade mending harness. You cut the ribbon, Alaric, in April. There was a small ceremony. You spoke very handsomely for 4 minutes and then rode to look at a horse." He had no memory of it. None. He searched for it and found nothing, a blank where a morning of his own life should have been, and the not remembering was a kind of vertigo. "I don't," he began and stopped, because there was no honest end to that sentence that did not damn him. "No," she said, not cruelly. She poured him tea without asking and pushed the sugar toward him, and he understood, watching her, that she knew precisely how he took it, that she had known for 11 years, that the knowing had all run one way like water down a hill. He took 2 lumps. She had known it would be 2. "Tell me about the day," he said. She looked at him. "The day." "Your day, what you do, from 7 o'clock when you come in here alone to whatever hour you go up." He heard how strange the request was even as he made it, a husband asking his wife of 11 years to describe her ordinary hours as though she were a foreign country he had just discovered lay adjoining his own. "I find that I do not know it. I should like to know it. That seems a poor enough place to begin, but it is where I am." For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then she folded her hands over the ledger and told him, in her level voice, and he listened as he had not listened to another human being in years. She rose at 6:30. She breakfasted here with the accounts because the morning was the only time the house was quiet enough to think in. At 7:30 she saw Mrs. Pettigrew about the day's marketing and the servants' small troubles, of which there were always some, a footman's mother ill, a housemaid courted by a groom the girl's family disliked, a scullery lad who could not read and was ashamed of it, whom Marian had been quietly teaching his letters on Sunday afternoons for a year. At 10 she went out. 3 days in the week she went into the village and the low farms, to the sick, to the lying-in women, to the old carrying broth and calf's foot jelly, and the plain remedies she had learned from a book and from the apothecary at Marbury, because the nearest doctor was 9 miles distant and charged more than the cottagers could pay. And so Her Grace of Ashbourne had made herself, over 11 quiet years, the physician of half a parish. The tenants did not tell the Duke of this because the Duke had never asked, and because a great man did not, in their experience, wish to be troubled with the whooping cough of a laborer's daughter. "You go alone," he said, "to the sick among the fevers." "Someone must," she said simply. "You gave the money for the almshouses, Alaric, and it was good of you and it kept them dry, but money is not the same as a hand. I found I would rather be the hand." She turned a page of the ledger without looking at it. "I did not do it to reproach you. I did it because the days were long and I had a great deal of care in me and nowhere to put it, and it turned out the parish would take what you would not. The last sentence was not cruel either. That was what he could not bear. She said none of it cruelly. She had gone so far past cruelty into a level, weary kindness that it stripped him barer than any reproach could have done. There is a wound that will take what you would not. He sat in her quiet morning room with his 2 lumps of sugar dissolving unheeded in his tea, and he saw the shape of the marriage he had had for 11 years without ever once looking at it, and it was not the shape he had imagined. He had imagined, when he thought of it at all, a rather bloodless arrangement of 2 sensible people. He saw now that he had been the bloodless one. She had been alive the whole time. She had poured a whole life's worth of love out into a parish because her husband had built a wall of estate business too high for any of it to reach him. "Come with me today," he said. She raised her eyes. "On your rounds, the low farms, the sick, whatever you do, let me carry the basket." He had never in his life carried a basket. He heard how absurd it must sound from the Duke of Ashbourne, and he did not care. "You said give you the truth I am willing to live. I do not yet know what truth I am willing to live, Marion, because until yesterday I did not know what my own life had in it. Let me see it. Let me carry the basket and hold the gate and be shown what my wife does with the care I never once asked her to spend on me. That is the first day. I will not make a speech at the sick. I will only carry the basket and look." She studied him a long moment, the way she had studied foolish men across drawing rooms for 30 years, seeing the exact shape of the folly. But she did not find, this time, only folly. Whatever she found made her set down her pen and rise. "Wear your old coat," she said. "The brown, not the good one. There will be mud and worse than mud, and a laboring man cannot say what he needs to say to a duke in a coat that cost more than his year. And Alaric," she paused at the door, and there was something in her face he had not seen turned on him in a very long time. Not warmth, not yet, but attention, the live attention of one person truly regarding another. "If you complain of the smell or the cold or the hours, I will send you home in the trap and I will not ask you again. These are not 4 days of your being amused. Do you understand me? These are 4 days of your being useful, or they are nothing." "I understand you," he said. She went to fetch her cloak, and Alaric went up to find the old brown coat he had not worn since he was a young man, mending fences with his own hands the year the estate nearly went under. And putting it on he caught sight of himself in the glass, and hardly knew the man he saw a duke in a laborer's coat, going out to carry a basket after his own wife. 34 years too late to the understanding that a life is not a ledger, and a woman is not a well-built house. The day was raw. The lane ran down between hedges beaded with cold to the cluster of cottages by the mill, and Marion walked it as one who knew every rut of it, and the people came out to her. That was the thing that lodged in him and would not leave. They came out to her. A woman with a baby on her hip and a face pinched with worry, who curtsied to him from long habit and then forgot him utterly to catch at her Grace's sleeve and pour out something about the child's chest, the rattling in it, the long nights. An old man on a bench who lifted his hat to the Duke and said, Lord, and then said, Bless you, Lady, in an entirely different voice, a voice with love in it. A girl of 9 who ran the length of a garden path to press a chalk drawing into Marion's hands, a drawing of a cat or a rabbit. It was difficult to say, and Marion received it as though it were a deed to a county, and admired it gravely, and the child glowed. Alaric carried the basket. He held gates. He stood in the low doorway of a cottage where a woman lay coughing and watched his wife kneel by the bed in her plain cloak, and lay the backs of her fingers against the sick woman's brow and speak to her low and steady, and mix something in a cup, and stay, not the 2 polite minutes a great lady stays, but the half-hour it took for the coughing to ease and the fear to go out of the woman's eyes. He stood in the cold with his back bowed under the beams, and he was, for once in his life, entirely unimportant. And he found the unimportance was a kind of clean, cold water poured over a fever he had not known he carried. At the door of the last cottage, the woman with the baby caught Marion's hand in both of hers. "You'll not really be leaving us, Lady," she said, low, so the Duke should not hear, though he heard. "Betsy at the great house says there's a bag packed. You'll not be going for good." Marion did not answer at once. Alaric, a little apart, holding the empty basket, went very still. "I don't know, Sarah," his wife said at last, gently. "I truly don't know, but whatever comes, the parish will be seen to. I have written it all down for whoever keeps the great house after me, where the sick are, who wants coal, which of the old will not ask and must be brought to. It is all in a book, you will not be forgotten." She had written a book, he thought, so that the parish would not be forgotten when she was gone. She had thought of everyone. She had thought of the coughing woman and the coal and the old who would not ask. The one person in 11 years whom nobody had thought to see to was Marion herself, and she had grown so used to that arrangement that she had made careful provision for the whole world to go on without her, and expected nothing to be made for her in return. They walked home in the falling dusk without speaking much, and at the gate of the great park Alaric stopped, because he could not carry it in silence one step farther. "You wrote a book," he said, "so that they would not be forgotten. Who wrote a book, Marion, so that you would not be?" She looked at him in the gray light. She did not answer. But she did not walk on either, and after a moment she took the basket from him, and their hands touched on the handle, cold hand to cold hand, and neither of them drew away as quickly as they might have, and that small failure to draw away was the whole of what the first day gave him, and he carried it up to the dark house as though it were a coal he must not let go out. The Dowager Duchess found him at breakfast the next morning, which was itself an event, for his mother did not as a rule appear below stairs before noon. She came in leaning on her stick, small and upright and formidable in gray silk, and she looked at her son sitting in the morning room over the household ledger with a cup of tea gone cold at his elbow, and she said, "So, it is true, the whole house is whispering it. Your wife has packed a bag, and you have gone soft in the head and begun following her about the parish in a laborer's coat like a lovesick under-gardener." She lowered herself into the chair across from him with the deliberate slowness of the old. "I did not raise you to make a spectacle of yourself, Alaric. You raised me, mother, to think of the estate before all things," Alaric said, and heard the edge in his own voice. "And I have obeyed you for 11 years, and it has nearly cost me my wife. So you will forgive me if I no longer take your instruction on the matter of spectacles." The old woman's mouth tightened, but she did not rise and she did not leave, and after a moment she said, more quietly than was her habit, "She is a good manager, I grant you. I never denied it. She has run this house better than I ran it, and I would rather have my tongue out than say so to her face." A pause. "Is it the child, after all this time, is it the child that has done it?" Alaric set down his cup. He and his mother did not speak of the boy. No one in the house spoke of the boy. It was the great silence at the center of Ashbourne, and to hear his mother name it, even so obliquely, was like hearing a bell rung in an empty church. "It is everything," he said. "It is 11 years of everything, but yes, I think it is partly the child. I was not with her. When it happened, I was in London, and when I came back I did not go to her, mother. I did not sit with her. I did not so much as take her hand. I told myself grief was a private thing. The truth is I was a coward, and I hid in the drainage, and I left her to bear it alone. And I have gone on leaving her to bear everything alone ever since. And now she has decided she would rather bear it in a cottage without me than in a palace with me, and I find that I cannot fault her arithmetic." His mother was silent a long while. The old face, so ready with its judgments, had gone still and inward. "Your father," she said at last, "was the same. Exactly the same. He was a great man and a cold one, and he loved me, I believe, as much as such a man can, which is to say he provided handsomely for me and never once asked how I did. I spent 40 years being provided for and never once asked how I did, and by the end I had forgotten there was any other way for a marriage to be. I taught you what I knew, Alaric. I taught you to be your father because I did not know there was anything better to teach. If your wife has found the courage to want more than I ever dared want, then—" the old voice wavered and steadied. "Then she is a better woman than I was, and you had best not let her go, because you will not find her like again, and you will spend 40 years being provided for by no one at all, and I would not wish that on my worst enemy, let alone my son." She rose, refusing his hand, and made her way to the door, and there she paused. "There are letters," she said, not turning. "In the muniment room, in the Japan box on the third shelf. She wrote to you the first year when you were forever away in the north about the drainage. Long letters. You gave them to me to keep the once, do you remember, when you were clearing your desk and said you had no time to answer them and I might do with them as I liked? I kept them. I do not know why. Perhaps because I recognized them. A breath. Read them, if you would understand what you have had 11 years and never opened, and then decide whether 4 days is enough or whether you had better beg her for the rest of your life." She went out. Alaric sat very still. He went to the muniment room within the hour. It was a cold stone chamber off the library where the estate's charters and deeds were kept, and the Japan box was where his mother had said, on the third shelf, black lacquer gone dull with dust, and inside it, tied with a faded ribbon, was a bundle of letters in a hand younger and rounder than the one he knew now, but unmistakably hers. He carried them to the window and untied the ribbon with clumsy fingers, and he read the letters his wife had written him in the first year of their marriage, that he had handed to his mother because he had no time to answer them. They undid him. She had loved him. That was the thing the letters said, plainly, on every page, the way a young woman says it who does not yet know she should be ashamed of loving a husband who does not love her back. She wrote to him of the house and the garden she was making, and a foolish thing the parson had said, and a book she was reading and wished he were there to argue with her about. And threaded all through it, artless and unguarded, was a bright thread of hope. She had married him thinking herself the sensible choice and had gone and fallen in love with him anyway in the first months, alone in his great house while he was in the north. And she had written him these long, warm letters full of herself and her days and her hopes for the two of them. And he had read them, if he had read them at all, standing up with his mind on the drainage, and he had answered them. He remembered now, and the remembering was a knife. He had answered them with 3-line notes about the weather and the coach, and once, God forgive him, with a note that said only that he was well and busy, and trusted she wanted for nothing. Trusted she wanted for nothing. She had wanted for the only thing in the world that mattered, and he had told her he trusted she wanted for nothing. And somewhere in that first year the letters had grown shorter, and then they had stopped, and he had not even noticed they had stopped, and the bright thread had gone out of his wife like a lamp turned down by a careful hand, and he had lived beside the darkened lamp for 10 more years and called it a sensible marriage. He read the last letter twice. It was short and it was not reproachful. She was never reproachful. He understood now that the not reproaching was itself the deepest thing he had done to her, that he had taught her over years that reproach was useless, that he could not be reached, that the only dignity left to a woman married to a wall was to stop throwing herself against it. The last letter said, "I will trouble you with no more of my little days, since you are so occupied with large ones. I am learning to keep my own counsel and to find my own company, and I dare say I shall grow quite good at it. Do not worry for me. I shall be perfectly well. Your M." I shall be perfectly well. He had received that letter 11 years ago and thought, if he had thought anything, that it was a great convenience to have a wife who required no answering. He held it now and understood it for what it was, the sound of a heart quietly closing a door it had held open too long into an empty room. He did not go to her that day with the letters. He wanted to lay them before her and say, "Look, I have read them at last, I know what you gave me and threw away." But he understood, sitting in the cold muniment room with the bundle in his hands, that to do so would be to make his understanding into another demand upon her. "See how I suffer, now comfort me," and he had done enough of that in his life without knowing it. The letters were not for his comfort. They were his accounting. He tied them up again and set them aside and resolved to earn, by deeds and not by grief, the right to speak of them at all. Second day then he did not follow her. He set himself instead to the one thing he could do without her seeing, which was to begin, quietly, to become a man who paid attention. He went to Mrs. Pettigrew, the housekeeper, who had served the family 30 years and loved his wife and distrusted him, and he asked humbly, a duke to a housekeeper, to teach him the household. Not the accounts, those he could read. The other thing, who was ill, who was courting whom, which maid's mother lay dying. the scullery lad who could not read. Mrs. Pettigrew looked at him for a long, hard moment with her hands folded on her apron, deciding whether this was a whim of the grate that would blow over by Michaelmas, and then, slowly, she told him. He learned that the footman James, who had stood in his hall for 6 years, had a brother pressed into a ship and gone these 3 years with no word, and grieved for him in silence. He learned the housemaid Ellen wished to marry the groom Tom, and that Tom's people thought her beneath them because her father had been in jail for poaching, and that her grace had been quietly setting a little aside toward a wedding portion for the girl so that Tom's people might be brought round. He learned that the scullery lad was named Peter and was 12 and clever and ashamed, and that her grace taught him his letters on Sunday afternoons in the still-room and had never told a living soul. And he did something he had never done in his life. He acted upon it. He wrote that same afternoon to a man he knew at the Admiralty, a hard man, useful, exactly the sort of man he had spent 11 years cultivating for the estate's advantage, and he spent that usefulness at last on something other than the estate. He asked after one pressed seaman, James's brother, by name and ship, and asked what might be done. It was a small thing. It might come to nothing. But he did it because his wife would have done it, and had not been able to, and he wanted for once in his life to be the hand, and not only the money. He was crossing the hall at dusk, having posted the letter with his own hand, when Marian came in from her rounds, cheeks bright with cold, and stopped at the sight of him. "You did not come today," she said, and he could not tell this was the maddening, hopeful thing, whether there was disappointment in it. "No," he said, "I had something to attend to, not the drainage." He almost told her. He wanted so badly to tell her, to lay James's brother and Ellen's portion and Peter's letters before her like a boy bringing his mother a fistful of crushed flowers. See, I have been paying attention. But he had resolved that his attention should not be a performance for her to applaud, and so he said only, "How was the coughing woman, Sarah's neighbor?" Marian went very still in the middle of the hall. He had remembered. He had remembered the coughing woman's name, and that she was Sarah's neighbor, and had asked after her as one asks after a person one has thought about. "Better," she said after a moment, and there was a small unsteadiness in her voice she did not quite master. "The fever broke in the night. She will do." "I am glad," he said, and found that he was. Truly glad, not because it is tidy, because she will do. They stood a moment in the great cold hall with the light dying in the tall windows, husband and wife, 11 years and a small stone and a bundle of unread letters between them, and something passed across the space that had not passed in a long time, and Marian was the first to look away, but she looked away, he thought, not to close a door, but because she did not yet dare leave it so plainly open. She went up to change for dinner. Alaric stood in the hall alone and thought, 2 days gone, 2 days left. And a thing was beginning to grow in the ruined ground between them, green and small and easily killed, and he had 2 days to keep from killing it, and he did not yet know that the very next morning the post would bring a letter that would put the whole of it to the hardest test of all. The letter came with the morning post, and Alaric knew the hand before he broke the seal, and the knowing sat cold in his stomach. Georgiana, Lady Marston now these 12 years, and widowed this past spring. He had heard of Marston's death in the spring and had felt, to his own faint surprise, nothing at all, only the distant closing of a door on a room he had stopped entering long ago. The letter was written in the same graceful, expensive hand he had once thought the finest in England. She was traveling north, she wrote, to her sisters, and her route would carry her within a few miles of Ashbourne, and she could not think of passing so near an old and valued friend without paying her respects. She would do herself the honor of calling on Thursday if he and the Duchess would receive her. She remained, as ever, his affectionate Georgiana. Thursday, the day the carriage stood ordered to take his wife to Wren's Hollow, the last of his 4 days. He sat with the letter in his hand and understood that fate, or his own past, or both, had contrived to lay before him on the very last morning the exact question his whole marriage had been the wrong answer to. 12 years ago he had wanted Georgiana Vale and been refused, and had married Marian as the sensible second thing, and had let his wife spend 11 years knowing herself the second thing. And now Georgiana was widowed and free and writing him affectionate letters and would arrive on the last day. And whatever he did with that arrival Marian would read, and read rightly, as the truest answer he could give to the question of whom, given the whole of it back again, the Duke of Ashbourne would choose. He knew what he ought to do. He ought to write back at once and put her off regret that they were not receiving, that the Duchess was indisposed, any civil untruth that kept the woman from the door. But some coward remnant of the old ambitious boy, some instinct trained over 11 years to keep the useful and the well-connected always sweet, hesitated over the cut of it. Lady Marston was a great lady with a wide acquaintance and a sharp tongue, and to refuse her at the door was to make an enemy who would tell the tale in 40 drawing-rooms. The old Alaric would never have made such an enemy for the sake of a mere feeling. He put the letter in his pocket. He did not answer it. He told himself he would decide later, which was, he would understand too late the decision. That evening he asked his wife to dine with him. Not at the vast table where they had eaten 100 dinners at opposite ends among guests who could be useful. He had the small round table in the library laid for two, and candles, and he asked her plainly, standing in the door of her morning room with his heart in his throat like a boy asking for a first dance, whether she would do him the honor of dining with him alone. She looked at him a long moment, and he thought she would refuse, and then she said, "Yes, I will," and something in the plainness of her yes was worth more to him than any speech. It was the best evening of his life, and he did not know until years afterward how nearly it was the last. They talked. That was all. They only talked, across the small table in the firelight, and it was a thing they had somehow never once done in 11 years. He asked her about her father, the scholar, dead now these 6 years, and she spoke of the old man with a tenderness that made her young again, of the untidy study and the arguments about the classics and the way he had loved her mind before any man thought a woman's mind a thing to love. Alaric listened and asked and listened again, and found that his wife was the most interesting person he had sat across a table from in a decade, and that he had had her at the end of his own table for a decade and never once turned to hear her. He told her in return things he had told no one. He told her of the year the estate nearly went under, the terror of it, the nights he had lain awake at 23 sure he would be the Ashbourne who lost Ashbourne, and how the fear had never truly left him, how every acre bought and every mortgage cleared since had been a wall built against that fear, and how somewhere in the building of the walls he had walled himself away from every living thing that might have made the walls unnecessary. "I thought if I made us safe enough," he said, "lo, there would be time for the rest, for this, for sitting at a small table and hearing about your father. I thought the safety came first and the life came after. I did not understand that the life is not a thing that waits at the end of the ledger. It is the thing you spend the ledger to protect, and I protected it so hard I forgot to have it." Marian was quiet. The firelight moved on her face and the silver at her temples, and he thought her more beautiful than the girl he had married, more beautiful than Georgiana Vale had ever been, and wondered how a man could be so blind for so long inside his own house. "Why did you never fight me?" he asked. "In all those years, you could have raged, you could have wept or reproached me or made scenes. I think a scene might have reached me when a silence never did. Why did you only ever go quiet?" She turned her wine glass slowly in her fingers. "Because I learned the first year that reproach was a coin you would not accept," she said. "I offered it. You do not remember, but I did twice, 3 times. I wept and I asked you to see me, and you looked at me each time as though I were a difficulty in the accounts, something to be soothed and set right and got past so you could return to the real work. And I could not bear to be a difficulty in your accounts, Alaric. I would rather be nothing at all than be a difficulty you managed, so I made myself nothing. I made myself so smooth and quiet and useful that you would never have to manage me, and I told myself it was dignity, and perhaps it was a little, but mostly it was that a woman will do a great deal to keep from watching the man she loves be patient with her." She set down the glass. "There, now you have the truth I have never told anyone. I loved you." I stopped throwing myself against you because it hurt too much to be caught so gently and set aside. That is the whole of it." He reached across the small table and took her hand, and this time neither of them pretended it was an accident, and she did not draw it away. "I read the letters," he said, "the ones you wrote me the first year. My mother kept them. I read them yesterday. Marion, I answered them with 3 lines about the coach. I want to be sick when I think of it. You wrote me your whole heart and I wrote you back about the coach." Her eyes were bright and she did not weep, but her fingers tightened on his. "You read them," she said. "Every one twice. I have them by heart now, I think. The garden you were making, the parson and the goose, the book you wanted me to argue about." He turned her hand over in both of his. "I am arguing about it now, whatever book it was. I am 11 years late to the argument, and I will argue about anything you like for the rest of my life if you will let me." She laughed then, a real laugh startled out of her, wet at the edges, and for one moment across the small table in the firelight they were not the Duke and the pack-bag Duchess, but a man and a woman who might, against all sense and all the wasted years, be beginning. He would remember that laugh. He would hold it against everything that came after. He should have told her about the letter in his pocket then. That was the moment. If he had said, "Georgiana Marston has written that she will call Thursday, and I mean to put her off, for you are the only choice I have ever wished to make and I am ashamed I did not know it 11 years ago," if he had said that, across the small warm table, with her hand in his and her laugh still in the air, all that came after might have been spared. But he did not say it. He held the good evening too dear to risk a shadow across it. He told himself he would deal with Georgiana quietly tomorrow, without troubling Marion with it at all. He told himself, in short, exactly the thing he had told himself for 11 years, that his wife was better off not troubled, that he would manage the difficult thing himself and spare her, that his silence was a kindness. He had learned so much in 3 days. He had not learned that. Thursday came gray and still. The carriage stood ordered in the yard. He had not asked her whether she still meant to take it, and she had not said. He rose resolved to write to Georgiana before breakfast and put her off, and found, going down, that resolve had come too late, for a traveling chaise was already turning in at the great gates early, hours early, and Lady Marston had never in her life been a woman who waited to be received. He met her in the hall because there was no help for it. She came in on a wave of scent and gray furs, beautiful still, 12 years handsomer than beautiful, and she gave him both her hands and her low warm laugh and said, "Alaric, you have not changed at all." And he stood there holding the hands of the woman he had once wanted. In the hall of the house his wife was that day preparing to leave, and he did the thing that undid 3 days of grace in 3 minutes. He hesitated. He did not step back from her hands. He did not say at once, coolly and clearly, "You must forgive me, Georgiana. My wife and I are much occupied this morning." He was caught off his footing, and the old training rose in him, the instinct to be smooth, to be charming, to keep the useful great lady sweet. And for the length of a breath, of 5 breaths, of a small ruinous eternity, he was the old Alaric again, standing too close and smiling too easily, and letting Georgiana Marston hold both his hands in the hall. And on the stair, unheard, unremarked, exactly as she had stood in 11 years of doorways watching him choose other things, stood Marion, dressed for a journey, her old brown portmanteau in her own hand, come down at last to take the carriage. And she saw her husband in the hall with the beautiful widow's hands in his, and his head bent, and his easy old smile, and she understood, with the swift, terrible clarity of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning to read exactly this, that whatever the last 3 days had been, when the real choice came and stood in his hall in gray furs, the Duke of Ashbourne had reached for it without a moment's thought. She turned very quietly and went back up the stairs, and by the time Alaric had gently freed his hands and remembered himself and looked up, there was no one on the staircase at all, only the cold light on the empty steps, and the sound, far off, of a chamber door closing with the softness of a heart that has finished hoping. "Georgiana," he said, and stepped back and took his hands out of hers, and heard his own voice come cold and clear across the hall. "You must forgive me. You have caught the house at an unfortunate hour, and I will not pretend otherwise even to spare your journey." Lady Marston's fine brows rose. She was not a woman accustomed to a cooling wind. "My dear Alaric, what a very strange welcome. I have come a long way to—" "You have come a long way to look over a widow in waiting," he said, and watched the small flare in her eyes tell him he had struck the truth. "You heard of Marston's death, and you remembered that I once wanted you, and you thought, perhaps you thought there might be a door here standing open. There is not. There has not been for a long time, though I was too great a fool to see it. I am a married man, Georgiana. I am married to the finest woman in England, and I have spent 11 years being unworthy of her, and I do not intend to spend the 12th adding your visit to the account. My carriage will take you on to your sister's within the hour. You will be more comfortable there." It was brutally done, and it made an enemy of her, exactly as the old careful Alaric had feared, and he found he did not care in the smallest degree. She gathered her furs and her dignity and said something cold and clever that he did not trouble to hear, and swept out to her chaise, and the great door closed behind her, and the useful, expensive friendship of Lady Marston was gone out of his life forever, and he had never in his life felt so clean. And then he looked up at the empty stair, and the cleanness turned to ash. He knew. He did not need to be told. He had spent 3 days learning at last to read the house, and the house told him now in every silence that she had seen. The brown portmanteau that had stood in her chamber was not in the hall where a departing traveler's bag would wait. She had come down with it and gone back up, and that meant she had come down while Georgiana's hands were in his and gone back up having seen it. And the 4 days he had begged for had ended not with his choosing her, but with her watching him, one last time, choose the smooth and easy thing in the very hall of the house she was leaving. He went up the stairs 3 at a time, and he did not knock. She was standing by the window with the bag at her feet, quite composed, and she did not turn when the door opened, and her stillness was the stillness of a woman who has already gone a long way off inside herself. "Marian, the carriage is ready," she said to the glass. "I have kept it waiting long enough. I only wanted to look at the garden once more, the one I made. It has done rather well over the years. I found I wanted to say good-bye to it." "You saw the hall?" "I saw the hall." "Then you will let me tell you what you saw, because you did not see the whole of it." He came into the room, and his voice was not steady, and he let it not be steady. "You saw me hesitate. You saw the old Alaric, the one who keeps the great lady sweet, who cannot bear to make an enemy, who reaches for the smooth thing without thinking. You saw him, and you were right to see him, because he is real, and he lived in me for 11 years, and 3 days does not kill a thing that has lived in a man for 11 years. I did hesitate. I am ashamed of it to the bone, but you left the stair too soon, Marian. You did not stay to see me put her out of my house. You did not hear me tell her, in that hall, that I am married to the finest woman in England and have spent 11 years being unworthy of her. You have spent your whole life leaving the stair a moment too soon, because you learned that if you stayed you would only watch me choose wrongly, and by God I have taught you that. I have taught you it 1,000 times, so I do not blame you for turning away. But you turned away a moment before the one time in 11 years I chose right." Now she turned. Her face was wet. She had wept silently, alone by the window, and dried it, and he had not been there for that either, and the sight of the dried tears was worse than any weeping. "Do you know what the cruelest thing is?" she said, very low. "It is not the hesitating. Men are weak. I have always known men are weak. I could forgive the hesitating. The cruelest thing, Alaric, is that for 3 days you made me hope. I had stopped. Do you understand what it costs a woman to stop hoping and then to start again? I had made my peace. I had packed my bag and written my book for the parish and said my goodbyes and made myself ready to grow old quietly and be content with the little I could gather for myself. And it was a small life, but it was mine, and it did not hurt. And you came and knocked on my door and carried my basket and read my letters and sat at a small table and made me laugh, and I let myself hope again. I let the whole terrible tide of it come back in, And then this morning I came down the stairs with my heart wide open like a fool, and there you were in the hall exactly as you have always been. And now I must pack it all away a second time. And I do not think I have the strength to do it twice, Alaric. That is why I am going. Not because you hesitated, because I cannot survive hoping and being wrong again. I would rather never hope than hope and be wrong again. He stood in the middle of her small green room and understood that he had not until this moment grasped the full weight of what 11 years had done. He had thought his task was to make her believe he had changed. He saw now that his task was harder and humbler than that. It was to make her believe that hoping was safe, when he was the very person who had spent a marriage teaching her it was not. There was no speech for that. There was no gesture grand enough. There was only, perhaps, the whole slow, patient rest of a life. And she was right that a life could not be shown in a morning. Then go, he said. She blinked. It was not what she had braced for. Go to Wren's Hollow, he said, and his voice cracked and he let it. I said I would hand you into the carriage myself and say not one word to keep you, and I am a man who is learning, very late, to keep his word. So go. Only, he drew a breath. Only understand what you are leaving me to, because it is the last true thing I have to give you, and you may as well have it. You are leaving me to a house that will be exactly as safe and exactly as prosperous and exactly as dead as I made it. You are leaving me to my ledgers and my mother and my walls, and every one of them will be in perfect order, and not one of them will ask how I do. You spent 11 years being the only warm thing in this house, Marian, and I was too great a fool to warm myself at you, and now you are taking the warmth away, and I will deserve the cold. I will deserve every hour of it. I only wanted you to know before you go that I finally understand what I am losing. Not a good manager. Not a convenience. I am losing the one person who ever loved me, and I let her do it for 11 years without once loving her back where she could see it, and I would give Ashbourne, the house, the land, all of it, the whole of the thing I traded my marriage to protect. I would give the whole of it this moment to have those 11 years again. That is the truth I am willing to live. There is no other. He stepped back from the door to leave it clear for her. The carriage is waiting, he said. I will not follow you. Be perfectly well, Marian. You always said you would be. I hope to God it is truer for you than it was for me. And he went out and down the stairs, and he stood in the great cold hall where an hour before he had put out the wrong woman, and he watched from the doorway as they carried the brown portmanteau out and handed his wife up into the carriage. And he did not go to her, because he had said he would not, and because he understood at last that going to her now would be one more thing done for himself and not for her. He let her go. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, and the first wholly unselfish one. And the carriage went down the long avenue between the bare trees and out at the great gates and was gone. And the Duke of Ashbourne stood alone in his hall in the grey noon, and felt the cold of the house he had built close over him like water over a stone. The afternoon was very long. He did not go to the ledgers. He found he could not bear the sight of them. He walked instead through the house, room by room, seeing it for the first time as she had seen it. The yellow drawing-room she had asked him to decide about, and he never had. The small still room where she had taught a scullery lad his letters on Sunday afternoons. The morning room with the blue-bound ledger still open on the table to the page of almshouse accounts. He walked out into the garden she had made in the cold without his coat, and stood among the beds she had laid out 11 years ago as a young bride full of hope writing letters to a husband who answered them with 3 lines about the coach. And he saw that even the garden had loved him better than he had loved it, that it had gone on blooming faithfully year after year for a man who never once walked in it. And he put his hand against the cold bark of the apple tree she had planted the spring they married, and he bowed his head, and something broke in him that had been holding rigid for 11 years, longer, for the whole of his careful frozen life. And the Duke of Ashbourne wept alone in his wife's garden like a boy. His mother found him there. He did not know how long she had been watching. She came across the grass slowly on her stick, small and gray in the failing light, and she did not tell him to compose himself, which was the greatest tenderness she had shown him in 40 years. "You let her go," the dowager said. I promised her I would. And now you mean to sit in this house being nobly heartbroken for the rest of your days, I suppose, and call it keeping your word. The old voice was sharp, but there was something under the sharpness he had never heard in it. You are your father's son to the last, Alaric. He would have done exactly this. He would have let me go rather than be seen to want me and called it dignity and died alone in a tidy house, and I would have let him because I never learned there was another way. She struck her stick against the ground. I am 81 years old and I have learned it this week, watching you, and it is the only useful thing I have learned in a quarter century, and I will be damned before I watch my only son die of the same disease that killed his father. You promised not to follow her to Wren's Hollow. Well, Wren's Hollow is 9 miles off and it is coming on to rain, and a woman who has just torn her own heart out twice in 1 week is not a woman who wants to be alone in a cold cottage tonight, whatever she said and whatever you promised. A promise made to spare her pride is not a promise you keep when keeping it will break her heart. Go after her, you great fool. Not to argue, not to make a speech, only to be there so that for once in 11 years she does not have to be strong alone. Now go before I take my stick to you. Alaric looked at his mother for a long moment in the rain that was beginning to fall, and then he kissed her cold cheek, which he had not done since he was a child, and he went to the stables himself and saddled his own horse with his own hands, and rode out into the failing light and the rising rain toward Wren's Hollow. The rain was full and cold by the time the lights of Wren's Hollow showed through the trees, and Alaric was soaked to the skin and did not feel it. The cottage was small and low and stone, her aunt's place, standing at the end of a rutted lane with one window lit gold against the streaming dark, and he got down at the gate and stood a moment in the rain looking at that single lit window, and he understood that everything he had learned in a week and everything he had wasted in 11 years came down now to how he crossed the last 30 feet of muddy path to that door. He did not go and pound on it and make his speech. He had made speeches enough. He tied the horse under the lean-to out of the wet and rubbed it down with a handful of straw, because a cold horse should not stand for a man's heartbreak, and then he went and stood under the small porch out of the worst of the rain, and he knocked quietly once. It was a long time before the door opened. When it did, she stood in it with a shawl about her shoulders and a candle in her hand, and she looked at him soaked, bareheaded, the rain running off him onto her aunt's step, and her face did not open and it did not close. It only looked tired past bearing, and she said, "You promised you would not follow me here." "I did," he said. "I have broken it. It is the first promise I have broken to you in 11 years, and I broke it on purpose, and I will tell you exactly why, and then you may shut the door in my face and I will ride home and never trouble you again." He was shaking with cold and did not try to hide it. "I did not come to argue. I did not come to make you hope. I did not come to say one word I said this morning. I came because it is raining and it is cold, and you have been strong entirely alone for 11 years, and I could not bear that tonight of all nights you should be strong alone in a cold cottage while I sat warm in a house you left because of me. I did not come to be let in, Marion. I came to be outside your door in the rain, so that for one night you would know there was a person in the world who could not rest for thinking of whether you were warm. That is all. You need not open the door. I will know you saw me. That is enough. Go back to your fire." And he stepped back from the door, out into the rain again, meaning it, meaning to stand the night on the wet path if she shut the door, meaning for once in his life to do a thing that cost him everything and bought him nothing but her knowing. "You are ridiculous," she said, and her voice broke on it. "You are the most ridiculous man in England. Get in out of the rain before you take a fever and I have to nurse you, and I have quite enough sick men in this parish already." He came in. The cottage was one warm room, low-beamed, a good fire, her aunt's old furniture, the brown portmanteau still packed and standing by the wall as though she had not yet been able to make herself unpack it, as though even here she had not fully decided. She made him take off the wet coat and sit by the fire, and she wrapped a blanket round his shoulders with hands that were not quite steady, and she was cross with him the whole while, cross the way a person is cross when crossness is the only wall left standing against something too large, and he let her be cross, and he did not say one word of love, because he had learned at last that there are hours when love is best spoken by simply sitting still, and being warmed and letting oneself be cared for by hands that have had no one to care for in a very long time. They sat a long while by the fire and did not speak. The rain ran down the small window. At length she said, without looking at him, "I nearly did not open the door. I know. I stood behind it and I thought if I open it, it will all begin again. The hoping, and I cannot." She drew the shawl tighter. "And then I thought of you standing in the rain being noble, and I was so angry, Alaric, I was so angry that even now, even here, you had found a way to make me open the door, and then I opened it anyway because I could not leave you in the rain, and I thought, there, that is the whole trouble. I have never once been able to leave you in the rain. 11 years I have not been able to leave you in the rain, and you have let me stand in it the whole time, and never once noticed I was wet." "I notice now," he said quietly. "I will notice for the rest of my life. It is too late to have noticed sooner, and I cannot give you back the 11 years, Marian. I have thought about it the whole ride here, and there is no way to give them back. A man cannot pay for 11 years. He can only stop the 12th from being the same, and then the year after and the year after that, 1 year at a time, for whatever years are left, and hope that the sum of them comes at last to something. I am not asking you to trust me tonight. I would be a fool to ask it, and you would be a fool to give it. I am asking only whether you would let me try to earn it, not in 4 days, not in a grand gesture, in years, in the slow ordinary way, breakfast by breakfast. If at the end of it you still find the sum does not come right, then I will let you go and I will not follow you into any rain, I promise it truly this time. But let me try to make the arithmetic come right. That is all I have to offer. The rest of my life spent learning the thing I should have known at the start." She was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Somewhere in the wet dark a night bird called. "I do not want a grand gesture," she said at last, very low. "I have watched you make grand gestures for great men for 11 years, and I have never once envied them. Do you know what I wanted, Alaric? All of it, the whole 11 years. I wanted you to come to my breakfast. That is all. I wanted, one single morning, for you to come down the passage to the morning room and sit in the chair that does not wobble and drink your tea with your 2 lumps of sugar and ask me how I did and mean it and listen to the answer. That is the whole of what I wanted. It is such a small thing. It is so small I have been ashamed my whole marriage of wanting it so badly. And you never came. 11 years and you never once came to breakfast." "I came the day before yesterday," he said. "You came because I had packed a bag." "I came because I had packed a bag," he agreed. "I am not going to pretend the bag did not do it. The bag did it. I am not proud of being a man who had to see the bag. But I came, Marian, and I sat in the chair that does not wobble, and I asked you how you did, and I listened to the answer, and it was the best hour I have had in 11 years, and I have thought since that I would give the whole estate to have 1,000 more of them. So here is what I can promise you, and it is the only promise I will make, because it is small enough that I can keep it. I will come to breakfast. Every morning that God gives me. Whatever else is burning, whatever the drainage or the mortgages or the useful men, I will come down the passage and sit in the chair that does not wobble and ask you how you do and listen to the answer, every single morning, for the rest of my life. If I miss one, you may pack the bag again, and I will hand you into the carriage myself and never say a word. That is the whole of my courtship, Marian. A man who comes to breakfast. It is all I have. I only pray it is what you wanted, because it is the truest thing I know how to give." She began to cry then, not the silent dried tears of the window, but real weeping, the weeping of 11 years let go all at once. And he did not reach for her, because he had reached for the wrong things his whole life and he was learning. He only sat and let her weep, and after a while she reached for him, which was the whole difference, and he held her by the fire in the small warm room while the rain came down, and neither of them said anything at all, and nothing had ever needed saying less. He did not stay the night. That mattered to him, and he made it matter. When the rain eased toward midnight he rose, and she did not ask him to stay, and he did not offer, because he understood that trust was a thing built in daylight over years and not stolen in a warm hour by a fire, and he would not take 1 inch of her he had not earned. He would court his own wife properly, from the beginning, as he should have done at the start. He kissed her hand at the door, only her hand, and said, "I will send the carriage in the morning, and you may come home or not come home, exactly as you choose, and either way I will come to breakfast here if you are here, at the great house if you are there. But I will come to breakfast." And he rode home through the wet dark with his heart so full it frightened him. She did not come home the next day. He had thought she might not and had schooled himself to it, and at 7 o'clock the next morning, instead of breakfasting alone in the great house, the Duke of Ashbourne had his horse saddled and rode the 9 miles to Wren's Hollow and knocked on the cottage door and asked whether he might come to breakfast, and she let him in, and they breakfasted at her aunt's small table on bread and honey, and he asked her how she did, and she told him, and he listened. He did it again the next morning, and the next, 9 miles there in the gray dawn and 9 miles back every morning in the rain and out of it, and he told no one why he rode out each dawn, though the whole household knew and the whole parish knew, and the grooms began, without being asked, to have his horse ready at 6:30. He did not ask her to come home. He had decided he would not ask, that the asking must be hers, when and if it ever came, freely or not at all. He only came to breakfast, 9 miles each way every morning, and asked her how she did, and listened, and rode home to his ledgers a changed man. It was the 11th morning. He had counted. He counted everything, and now at last he counted the right things, that he arrived at Wren's Hollow to find the brown portmanteau standing packed by the door, and his heart stopped, until she opened the door before he could knock, and he saw her face, and understood that the bag was packed this time to go the other way. "You had better hand me into the carriage yourself," she said, and her eyes were bright, and there was the old smile, the real one, the one from the letters, come back to her face after 11 years. "Since you are so fond of promising it. Only this time, Alaric, you are handing me in to go home." He handed her into the carriage himself, as he had promised, and this time he did not stand in a doorway and watch it go. This time he swung up onto his horse and rode alongside it the whole 9 miles home, in a fine cold morning with the sun breaking through at last, and every rut of the lane that he had ridden alone 11 mornings running he now rode beside her. And once, where the road ran level and open, she put her hand out of the carriage window into the cold, bright air, and he leaned from the saddle and took it, and so they came home to Ashbourne hand in hand, the Duke on his horse and the Duchess in her carriage. And the household was in the yard to see it, every last one of them, Mrs. Pettigrew and the footmen and the maids and the grooms and the scullery lad Peter with his cap in his hands. And when the carriage stopped they made a sound, all of them together, a kind of low glad murmur that was not quite a cheer, because one did not cheer one's masters, but was a cheer for all that, and Marian looked at them out of the window with her eyes full and said, "Oh," very softly, "oh." I did not think and could not finish. And Alaric understood that his wife had not known, in 11 years, how loved she was, not only by the parish but by her own house, because no one had ever thought to show her, least of all him, and he resolved that she would never again spend a day of her life not knowing it. The dowager was on the steps. She came down them slowly on her stick, and she went to the carriage door before Alaric could hand his wife out, and she took Marian's 2 hands in her old ones and held them. And the 2 women looked at each other, the young one and the old one, who had never in 11 years exchanged a wholly warm word. And the dowager said, in a voice the whole yard could hear because she meant the whole yard to hear it, "Welcome home, Duchess. This house has been a poorer place for the one of you, and I chief among the fools who did not say so. I'm 81 years old, and I have been wrong about a great many things, and about none of them so wrong as about you, come in out of the cold. I have had them light the fire in the yellow drawing-room. You may finally decide what is to be done with it. It has waited 11 years for your deciding, and I will hear no more nonsense about whether it is your place to choose. It is your house, girl. It always was. We only forgot to tell you." And Marian, who had borne 11 years of that sharp old tongue without once flinching, put her arms around the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne in the cold yard before the whole household and wept on her shoulder, and the old woman patted her back with a hand that trembled and said, there is no need for all this water, you will rust my brooch," which fooled no one. least of all Alaric, who saw the tears standing in his mother's fierce old eyes and loved her for them. They went in, and the life that began that day was not a grand thing, and that was its whole glory. It was made entirely of small things, the small things Marian had wanted all along and been ashamed of wanting, and Alaric spent the rest of his days learning to see how large the small things were. He came to breakfast. That first morning home he came down the passage to the morning room at 7 o'clock and sat in the chair that did not wobble and drank his tea with his 2 lumps of sugar and asked his wife how she did, and she told him, and he listened, and he never once missed a morning after, not when the London lawyers came, not when the roof of the tithe barn fell in, not when he was ill, not when she was, not in 11 more years and then 11 more after that. Long after, when they were old, the servants would say that you could set the church clock by the Duke of Ashbourne coming to his wife's breakfast, and that in all the years no one could remember him missing it but the once, when the great flood came, and he was out to his waist in the low fields till dawn getting the Carter family off their roof. And even then he had come home caked to the chest in mud, and sat down dripping in the chair that did not wobble and asked her how she did before he would so much as change his clothes, because a promise was a promise, and this was the only one he had ever truly kept, and he kept it as other men keep their souls. But the breakfasts were only the beginning of it. He learned the parish. He did not take it over from her. He had the sense at last to see that it was hers, that she had built it out of 11 years of exiled love, and that it was the truest thing she owned, and he would no more have taken it from her than cut off her hand. But he learned it. He went on her rounds, not as a spectacle now but as a partner, and where her hands were skilled at the sickbed, his were good for other things, for the money that mended a roof before the winter, for the word in the right ear that got a widow's grievance heard at the quarter sessions, for the sheer weight of a duke's name laid down at last on the side of the small, and the overlooked instead of only the great and the useful. The parish that had loved the Duchess and merely respected the Duke came, over the years, to love them both, and to speak of them together, the Duke and her Grace, as one names a single warm thing. And the great house changed. It had been for 11 years a cold and perfect machine, and it became, slowly, a home. The yellow drawing-room was done at last, in Marian's own taste, warm and unfashionable and comfortable, and it became the room the family truly lived in, and the fashionable cold state rooms fell into the disuse they had always deserved. There was music in the house of an evening, for it turned out Marian played, had always played, and had left off years since because there had been no one to play for. And now there was someone to play for, and the sound of the pianoforte came down the passages of an evening where for 11 years there had been only the ticking of clocks. There was laughter at the dinner table, which was moved, on ordinary nights, from the vast and formal expanse where they had sat at opposite ends among useful strangers to the small round table in the library where they had first truly talked, and where they took most of their dinners for the rest of their lives, close enough to touch, arguing about books. The scullery lad Peter learned his letters, and then his sums, and Marian would have made a clerk of him. But it turned out the boy had a gift for growing things, and so the Duke himself, who 11 years before could not have named a single servant in his house, apprenticed Peter to the head gardener. And in time Peter grew into the finest gardener in 3 counties and never left Ashbourne, and tended to the end of his days the beds that her Grace had laid out as a young bride, and taught the trick of them to his own successor, so that the garden a lonely woman had made out of her hope went on blooming long after the woman herself was gone, which is perhaps the nearest thing to immortality that this world reliably grants. And the housemaid Ellen married her groom Tom. That was a thing Alaric did with his own hands, and he was prouder of it than of any bargain he had ever struck in the city. He learned, in his lessons from Mrs. Pettigrew, the whole sad snarl of it, the girl's father in jail for a hare, Tom's respectable people looking down their noses, the young pair loving each other across a gulf of a few shillings and a great deal of pride. And he saw that his wife had been quietly setting aside a portion for the girl for 2 years and had not enough yet, and he did the thing that a duke can do and a duchess on her own could not. He sent for Tom's father, a hard tenant farmer of 40 years standing, and he sat the man down and he said plainly, man to man, "You think the girl beneath your son. I will tell you what I have lately learned about a man who marries a woman he thinks beneath him and then treats her as though she were. It makes a ruin of 2 lives in 30 years, and I speak, as you know, from a nearer example than you might suppose. Ellen loves your Tom, and Tom loves Ellen, and she is honest and clever and kind, and her father was a fool over a hair and has paid for it, and the sins of the father are the father's. I will settle a portion on the girl that will make your son a freeholder, not because she needs buying respectable, but because I owe a debt to every match that is made for love in defiance of pride, having very nearly wrecked my own by yielding to it. Now, will you give them your blessing, or will you make me think less of you than I wish to?" And the farmer, who had never in his life been spoken to so by a great man, and never so honestly, gave his blessing, and Ellen married her Tom in the parish church in the spring, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne sat in the family pew and watched it, and afterward there was ale and a fiddle on the green, and Alaric danced with his own wife on the village green in the sight of the whole parish, which no Duke of Ashbourne had done in living memory, and Marian laughed up at him breathless and said, "You will scandalize your mother," and he said, "My mother is over there dancing with the blacksmith, look," and she was, the old terror, small and upright and stamping out a country measure with the vast smiling blacksmith, and the two of them, husband and wife, laughed until they had to stop dancing, and that was a day they spoke of for the rest of their lives. There was a custom he began that first winter home, and it outlasted him, and the parish keeps it yet. For 11 years, the great house of Ashbourne had shut its doors at Christmas. His father had held it a vulgar thing to fling open a nobleman's house to laborers, and Alaric had inherited the opinion along with the estate and never once examined it. And so the 12 days had passed, year upon year, in cold state, a formal dinner for the neighboring gentry, the useful families, the men who mattered, while beyond the park gates the cottagers kept their own small Christmases in the smoke and the cold, and the two worlds never touched. Marian had grieved it silently for 11 years. He learned, had longed to throw the doors wide and never dared, because it was not her house to open. He opened it. That first winter he told Mrs. Pettigrew to make ready the great hall for the whole parish, every tenant, every laborer, every widow and orphan and old soul in 3 miles, on the day after Christmas, and the housekeeper looked at him as though the world had turned over, which for the house of Ashbourne it had. And they came. They came shy at first, in their Sunday best, clutching their caps, up the long avenue they had walked all their lives only to touch their hats to a passing carriage, into the great hall where fires roared in both the vast hearths and the long tables groaned, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne stood at the door and welcomed each of them by name, every one, for he had learned them now, all of them. And there was not a soul who came through that door whom the Duke could not greet by his own name, and ask after his own trouble. That was the thing that undid the parish, and Marian saw it undo them, and Alaric saw her see it. It was not the fires or the food, though the food was welcome enough in a hard winter. It was being known. A great man who knew your name and your mother's illness and your boy's cleverness and asked after all of it, standing in his own hall in his fine coat, was a thing that half of them had never met in their lives, and it warmed them past the reach of any fire. Old Besom from the almshouse wept into his ale and had to be comforted. The Lammas boy with one arm was set at the Duke's own right hand and made much of. Peter the gardener's boy, scrubbed and shining, was toasted by the head gardener before the whole hall as the finest young hand in the county, and turned scarlet, and was happy. And when the fiddler struck up, the Duke of Ashbourne led out, for the first dance, not the wife of the neighboring baronet, but his own wife, in the sight of the whole assembled parish, and danced with her under the smoky rafters where his father would have shuddered to see it, and the parish cheered them, openly this time, no longer troubling to pretend it was anything but a cheer. Marian was flushed and laughing when the dance ended, and she drew him aside into the window embrasure where they could not be overheard, and she said, Do you know what I wished for all those years? On the day after Christmas, when I sat in the cold state dining room among your useful neighbors and made the correct conversation and watched the candles burn down, I wished for exactly this. Word for word. This hall, these people, that fiddle, you dancing where your father would have died of it. I never told you because it was not mine to wish, and you have gone and made my whole secret wish come true, and you did not even know it was my wish. How did you know, Alaric? I did not know it was your wish, he said. I only asked myself what you would do if you were free to do anything, and had no husband's cold pride standing in your way, and the answer was, she would fling open the doors and learn everyone's name and dance with the whole parish till dawn. So I did the thing I thought you would do. I have been trying to become the sort of man who does the things you would do, so that when I cannot ask you, or when I want to surprise you, I have only to ask myself, what would she do, and do that, and I am nearly always right, because you are the best person I have ever known, and it is not difficult to guess what the best person you have ever known would do. You simply do the generous thing and the warm thing and the thing that costs your pride, and there she is. I have spent 11 years learning to think like the useful men. I would rather spend the rest of them learning to think like you. She looked at him for a long moment, in the window, with the firelight and the fiddle and the whole warm, roaring hall behind her, and she did not say anything at all. She only took his hand, and held it, and they stood a while and watched the parish be happy in the house that had been cold for 150 years and was cold no longer. And that Christmas custom, the opening of the hall and the naming of every soul, went on every year of their lives and was carried on by their daughter after them and by her children after her, so that a warmth one lonely woman had wished for in silence, and one humbled man had guessed at and given her, went on warming that corner of the county for generations, long after the names of the two who began it had faded from all but the parish register and the small stone in the churchyard grass. The book, too, found its proper end. He had not forgotten it, the plain bound book in which Marian had written down the whole care of the parish, so that it should not be forgotten when she was gone, where the sick were, who wanted coal, which of the old would not ask and must be brought to. She had made it as a woman makes a will, out of the certainty that she was leaving, and that the warmth she carried must be handed on to colder keepers. Alaric asked her for it one evening quietly, and she gave it to him, and he read it through from cover to cover, every entry in her small, even hand, and it was the finest thing he had ever read, and it shamed the ledgers he had spent his life over into the dust they deserved. You meant this for whoever came after you, he said. I did. Then I will keep it if you will let me, and we will write in it together from now on, the two of us, so that when we are both gone there will be a whole life of it here, all the names, all the winters, all the ones who would not ask. He turned the pages gently. You made it out of leaving. Let us keep it up out of staying. It seems to me the better use of a book. And so they did. Every winter of their lives the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne added to the parish book in two hands now, her small and even and his growing steadier at the work year by year, and it was passed down after them with the estate itself, and their daughter wrote in it and hers, and it lies still, they say, in the muniment room at Ashbourne on the third shelf, where once a Japan box had held a bundle of unanswered letters, the two books changing places, as it were, across a marriage. The letters know one reed put away, and the book of names taken up, which is as fair a picture of what became of that man and that woman as anything I could set down. The seaman came home at midsummer. Alaric had near forgotten the letter he had written the second of those 4 days, the letter to the hard man at the Admiralty, spending at last on something warm the usefulness he had spent 11 years hoarding for the estate. He had written it and posted it and heard nothing, and told himself it would come to nothing, as such things generally did. But the wheels of great men grind, when they grind at all, in their own slow season, and one warm evening in June, a footman came to say there was a sailor at the kitchen door asking for James, and would not the household please come, for James had gone down on his knees in the yard and could not rise for weeping. Alaric went out. In the golden light of the long evening stood a thin brown weathered man in a sailor's slops, 3 years lost and given up for dead, with James's own face worn 10 years older by sun and salt, and the two brothers clung to each other in the middle of the stable yard and shook, and the whole household stood about them and wept without shame, and Marian came and stood at Alaric's side and slipped her hand into his and said, very low, "Did you do this?" "I wrote a letter," he said, "in February, one of the 4 days. I did not tell you. I did not want it to be a thing I did for you to see. I wanted it to be a thing I did because you would have done it if you could, and you could not because a duchess cannot write to the Admiralty and a duke can, and I had spent 11 years writing to the Admiralty only for myself." He watched the brothers, and his voice was not quite steady. "I did not know if it would come to anything. I am glad it came to something. He has a mother, James's brother, in the village. Someone had better go and tell her before the gossip beats us to it, or the shock will do for her." Marian looked up at him for a long moment in the golden light, and there was something in her face he had waited 11 years and 11 more to see, a thing that went past love into a kind of astonished gladness, and she said, "Alaric, do you know what you have become?" And he said, "A man who comes to breakfast," and she laughed and pressed his hand, and went herself to tell the old woman in the village that her son was risen from the sea, because that was a thing best done by hands, and she was the hands, and now at last so was he. It was that same summer that they went together to the churchyard. They had never gone together. In 11 years Alaric had gone perhaps 3 times, alone, furtively, and stood a bad 5 minutes by the small stone and gone away sick and cold, and unable to feel anything but the great grey water he had spent his life fleeing. And Marian had gone, he learned now, every week, every single week for 11 years alone, and tended the small grave with her own hands, and he had not known it, because they had grieved the one grief of their marriage as they had done everything else, at opposite ends of a great cold house, in silence, alone. It was she who asked him. That was the measure of how far they had come that she could ask him. She said one still Sunday evening, "I go to the churchyard on Sundays, to him I have gone every Sunday. I never asked you because I did not think you wished, and then later I did not think you would come, and I could not have borne asking and being refused, not about that." She looked at her hands. "I am going now. I find I should like you to come, but you need not, Alaric. It is a great deal to ask after so long, and if it is too much—" "It is not too much," he said. "It is 11 years overdue. Come, let me carry the flowers." They walked to the church in the long light, and she showed him the small stone, which he had seen but never truly looked at, and there was the name on it, the name they had chosen and then never once said aloud in 11 years, and Marian knelt and laid the flowers and was quiet, and Alaric stood a moment, and then he did the thing he had not been able to do the day the boy died, the thing his whole life had been arranged to keep him from doing. He knelt down beside his wife in the churchyard grass, and he let the great grey water come, and it did not drown him. That was the discovery of it. It did not drown him. He had spent his whole life certain that if he once let the grief in it would pull him under and he would never surface. And so he had built the walls and the ledgers and the drainage and the safe cold house, all of it, a whole life's worth of engineering, against a flood he had never once actually let himself feel. And now, kneeling in the grass beside the one person in the world who had loved the boy as he had, he felt it, the whole of it, 11 years of it, and it rose and it broke over him, and it passed the way water passes and left him kneeling still, wrung out and emptied, and for the first time in his life not afraid. "I was not with you," he said when he could speak. "When he came and went, I was in London, and when I came home I did not come to you. I stood in your doorway and I did not come in, Marian, because I was afraid of exactly this, of what I am doing now, and I have been afraid of it for 11 years, and I let you bear it alone every Sunday of 11 years rather than kneel down once in this grass beside you. That is the worst thing I have done. Worse than the letters, worse than the breakfasts I missed, worse than all of it. I left you alone with our son. I am here now. I am 11 years late, and I am here now, and I will come every Sunday for the rest of my life, and you will never kneel in this grass alone again." She turned to him and her face was wet, and she did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right and she was too honest to say so. She only put her hand to his cheek in the churchyard in the long gold light and said, "You are here now." And that was the whole of the absolution, and it was enough. And they knelt together a long while by the small stone and grieved their boy together at last. And then they rose and walked home in the dusk. And something that had been broken in the house of Ashbourne for 11 years was, if not mended, at least no longer borne alone, which is perhaps all the mending this world affords. The dowager did not live to see them grow truly old, but she lived long enough to see the change settled and sure, and she died the following winter in her sleep, having been in her last year gentler than she had been in her whole life before, as though watching her son learn to love had taught the old woman something she had been waiting 80 years to learn. Near the end she called Marion to her and held her hand and said, "I was cruel to you. For years. I told myself it was because you were not grand enough, and it was a lie. It was because you loved him, and I had never dared love his father so, and I could not bear the sight of a courage I had lacked. Forgive an old woman her jealousy of a young one's braver heart." And Marion forgave her, and held her hand to the end. And it was Marion, not Alaric, who wept the hardest at the funeral, which told the whole parish everything it needed to know about what kind of woman the Duchess of Ashbourne was, and what kind of house she had made out of a cold one. And the years went on as years do, and they were good years, the best of Alaric's life, and he believed of hers, though he never stopped being ashamed that the first 11 had been wasted, and she never quite let him forget it. She would say sometimes, dry as ever, "You were a very great fool for a very long time, you know," and he would say, "I know it better than any man alive," and she would say, "Well, see that you remember it." And he did. He remembered it every morning of his life when he came down the passage to the chair that did not wobble, remembered it as a man remembers the edge of a cliff he once walked blind along, and did not fall from only by a mercy he had done nothing to deserve. There was, in the fullness of time, one more mercy, and it came late and unlooked for, as the best mercies do. They had long since given up any thought of children. Marion was past 40 by the year Alaric came at last to his senses, and neither of them spoke of it, and both of them, privately, grieved it as one more thing the wasted years had cost. And so it was a thing beyond hoping when, in the 4th year of their true marriage, Marion came to breakfast one gray morning and sat in her place and said nothing for a long while, and Alaric, who had learned at last to read her silences as he had once read only ledgers, set down his cup and said, "What is it? Something is different. Tell me." And she told him, and his hands began to shake, and he came round the small table and knelt by her chair, the chair that did not wobble, and put his head against her and could not speak for a long time, and she stroked his hair, gone iron-gray now, and said, "It is early yet. We must not hope too hard. You know what happened before. We must be careful and calm and not," and he lifted his head and said, "I will not leave your side. Do you hear me? Not for a day, not for an hour. Whatever comes, I will be here in this house at the foot of that bed, holding your hand. I was in London once. Never again. Never, never again." And she saw that he meant it, and she wept, and he held her, and they did not let themselves hope too hard, and they hoped anyway, because the heart does not take instruction. He kept his word. When her time came, he did not stir from the house. He sat outside her door through a long day and a longer night, and when the physician tried to send him down to his study, as physicians do, to spare a gentleman the noise of it, Alaric looked at the man with the whole cold weight of the Duke of Ashbourne behind his eyes and said, "I left this house once while my wife was in her travail, and I have paid for it every day for 15 years, and I would sooner die on this floor than leave it again. You will let me sit where I can hear her, and if she calls for me you will bring me to her, and that is the end of the matter." And the physician, who had brought half the county into the world and thought he had seen everything, saw something he had not seen before, and let the Duke sit. The child lived. A daughter, small and loud and furious, born in the gray hour before a winter dawn, and when they brought her out at last and put her in his arms, Alaric of Ashbourne, who had been the coldest man in 3 counties and had made himself learn to be the warmest, stood in the passage with his daughter against his chest, and wept without shame in front of the servants for the third time in his life, the first having been in the garden and the second in the churchyard. And he understood that a man's life is measured not by what he builds, but by what he lets himself feel, and that he had been born, truly born, at the age of 37 in a doorway before a packed bag, and everything worth having had come to him since. They named her for no one in the family. They named her Grace, which the parish thought a fine plain name for a duke's daughter, and which Alaric and Marian alone knew to be a private joke, and a private prayer both for Grace was the thing that had come to them undeserved, late, and complete, and they had agreed, laughing and weeping together over the cradle, that they could not in conscience call the child anything else. Grace grew up in a warm house. That was the whole of what her parents had set themselves to give her, and they gave it. She grew up in a house with music in it of an evening and laughter at a small round table, a house where her father came to her mother's breakfast every single morning and asked her how she did and listened to the answer, so that the child grew up believing, as a plain and settled fact of nature, that this was simply what a husband was, a man who came to breakfast, and carried that belief out into her own life and her own marriage in the fullness of time, and was happy. Because a child raised in a warm house does not know she has been given anything remarkable, she thinks the whole world is warm, and that not knowing is the finest inheritance a parent can leave. Alaric lived to be an old man. He and Marian grew old together in the house he had once made a machine and she had made a home, and the parish that had loved her first came in the end to love them equally, the Duke and her Grace, who were to be seen of a fine morning walking the lanes arm in arm, or of a Sunday kneeling together in the churchyard grass by a small stone, or of an ordinary weekday at a small table in the library, two gray heads bent close, arguing without heat about a book. And every morning of his long life, in health and in sickness, in the years of plenty and the one hard year of flood, the Duke of Ashbourne rose and came down the passage to the morning room and sat in the chair that did not wobble, and asked his wife how she did, and listened to the answer, and it was the whole of his religion and the whole of his happiness and the one promise, out of a life that had once been careless of promises, that he never in his days broke. When she asked him once near the end, when they were both very old and the fire was low and Grace was long grown and gone to a warm house of her own, when she asked him, half teasing and half not, what he thought of when he thought of their long marriage, whether it grieved him still the 11 years, Alaric was quiet a while, watching the fire, holding her hand in his that was spotted now and thin. "I think of the bag," he said at last, "the little brown bag at the foot of your bed. I have thought of it every day for 40 years, and I hope to think of it on the day I die. Because I was a dead man, Marian, all those years, and I did not know it, and I would have gone down to my grave a dead man in a warm house and never once known I had been alive, and you packed a bag. You packed a single bag, and you were going to walk out of my life with your dignity in your hand and let me have the whole of Ashbourne to be dead in, and it was the kindest thing anyone ever did to me, though it was meant to be the last unkind thing the world did to you. It woke me. Nothing else would have. Not a lifetime of your patience, not the letters, not the churchyard, not the boy. Only the bag, so no, it does not grieve me. It humbles me every day of my life, which is a different thing and a better one, and I would not trade the humbling for any easy happiness in the world. I was chosen last once by my own aunt's list. Do you remember? I told you, near the bottom of a list. And I chose you last too, God forgive me and let you know it. And then you packed a bag, and I found, standing over it, that a man who has been a fool for 11 years can still, if he is very lucky and does not deserve it in the least, spend the next 40 choosing you first. Every morning, first, before the ledgers and the drainage and the whole of the world. That is what I did with the years you gave me back. I chose you first every single morning until it was no longer a choice at all but only the shape of me, the way the riverbed is the shape of the river. And I would do it again and forever, and it would not be enough to pay for the 11 years, and I have stopped trying to pay for them, and I only love you, Marian, which is the one thing I should have started with and did not, and the one thing I mean to end with, and here we are at the end, and I am ending with it. I love you. Come to breakfast in the morning. I will be there. I have always been there since the day of the bag. I will always be there." And she came to breakfast in the morning, and he was there in the chair that did not wobble as he had promised. And they had, in the end, a great many mornings, more than either of them had any right to. And when at the last there was a morning that one of them came to alone, it was said in the parish that the one who was left did not weep so much as wait, quietly, with great patience and no fear, the way a person waits who knows that the other will keep the promise, and come to breakfast, wherever breakfast is kept in the country past this one. And that is where we may leave them, the Duke and his Duchess, the man who learned too late and then loved on time for 40 years, and the woman who packed a single bag and without meaning to, gave a dead man back his life.